Welcome everybody to this deliberative online town hall. I'm Amy Leigh, Associate Director of the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, or IDEA, at Ohio State University, and I'll be serving as your moderator this evening. IDEA is partnering with the University of Canberra's Center for Deliberative Democracy on today's town hall, which is part of the Connecting to Parliament Research Initiative. Connecting to Parliament is a research partnership whose goal is to find the most effective methods of constituent engagement. We're hoping to find out how participating in a deliberative town hall affects your opinion on an issue and how deliberative public opinion can actually be a force in policymaking and governance. I'm going to go briefly over the agenda and ground rules for this town hall, and I will then turn it over to the Center for Deliberative Democracy's Professor John Dryzik for an acknowledgement of country and to give us a brief explanation of the policy issue we're discussing today, before turning it over to our featured Member of Parliament, Andrew Leigh, for brief opening remarks. And then we'll get to your questions. First, just a word about us. Connecting to Parliament is a nonpartisan, independent research initiative of political scientists at the University of Canberra and the Ohio State University. Our goal is to learn how members of Parliament can connect with the full range of their constituents, not just the loudest voices in the room, and get actionable, deliberative input on public policy so that democracy works better for everyone. All Connecting to Parliament online town halls, like this one, focus on a single issue. They provide participants with nonpartisan background materials in advance so that you can have an in-depth conversation about the issue with your elected officials. We work to bring together a diverse, representative set of constituents for these events so that your lawmakers can hear from the full range of their district. Our Connecting to Parliament events are independent and nonpartisan. Andrew Leigh has graciously agreed to participate in today's session, but the format of the event is entirely up to us, and the questions and comments are entirely up to you. So I'll give the instructions for entering those questions in just a minute, but let me first explain our method for passing on your questions to Andrew. We, the Connecting to Parliament research team, will simply be gathering the questions that you submit in the order you submit them, combining any similar ones or eliminating those that have already been asked and answered, and then relaying them to Andrew. If you have already asked one question, we are going to try to get to everyone once before we do anyone's second question, so please keep that in mind if you have a lot to say. Questions that are off topic will not be added to the queue. It is fully okay to disagree with Andrew or with your fellow constituents, but we do ask that you remain respectful. And lastly, if we don't get to your question, it will still be shared with the MP's office after the session. So I'll give the instructions for how to submit those questions in just a moment. And how you can do that is you can simply go ahead and start submitting questions now. We'll be hearing a little bit about the issue from Professor John Dryzik in just a moment. But if you'd like to start submitting questions now, you can do that by just clicking the question button in your control panel. If you don't see the question mark button, you may need to expand your control panel. So look in the upper right corner of your computer screen for a small orange rectangle with a white arrow in it. Click that and the control panel should expand, then click the question panel and it will allow you to text in your question. Don't forget to hit send. That will be received by our Connecting to Parliament team and added to the queue. So we thought it would be helpful to start off tonight's session with a bit from Professor John Dryzik about the policy we'll be discussing today, mitochondrial donation, and the ethical, legal, and technological considerations that the public should be wrestling with. John Dryzik?
Okay. Thank you, Amy. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, even though we're meeting online, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, I'd like to stress again that our centre at the University of Canberra is non-partisan. This is not a party political event, and we'd be interested in doing something similar with members from other parties. Now, this town hall is about mitochondrial donation. This is a new reproductive technique, like IVF, that is being developed to prevent mitochondrial disease, which can be fatal, though there is a variety of different types, from being passed from mother to child. We chose this topic because there is a free vote coming up in Parliament on whether to legalise the technology, which means that Andrew Leigh does not have to vote the party line. The technology involves combining material from the egg of a donor and the egg of the mother with the sperm of the father. These techniques require the harvesting of eggs from the mother and the donor in vitro fertilization, or IVF, and then reimplantation. This is a new technology, and so there's still uncertainty about how effective it will be and how safe it will be in the long term. The current situation is that mitochondrial donation is prohibited under Australian laws because the procedure involves alterations to the genetic material of a human that will be passed on to subsequent generations. Some laboratory research on these technologies is, however, currently permissible in Australia. Now, of course, it's up to you to decide what questions you might have about the technology to ask of Andrew Leigh. But I'll just give a few examples of the range of the possible questions. They could, for example, relate to the safety of the technology, its likely benefits in comparison to its alternatives, potential misuses of the technology, the cultural, ethical, and religious values that might be relevant to questions about birth, reproduction, and genetics, the cost of the technology, the regulation of the technology by government, and issues for parents, equity and access to the treatment, and the impact on children who will be born from the process and on subsequent generations. As I say, the precise content of the question is entirely up to you. So let me now hand it back to Amy.
All right, thank you. Now that we've all begun thinking about the issue, I'm going to repeat those instructions for asking a question or making a comment one more time. Just click the button with a question mark in your control panel to type your question in the box and just hit send. And that'll be received by our team and added to the queue. If you don't see that button, remember you may need to expand the control panel. It's the small orange rectangle with a white arrow in it, and that will expand, and then you'll be able to see the question mark and type in your question. All right, so go ahead and get started sending those in. I see a couple starting now. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our guest today, Andrew Leigh, for opening remarks.
Daranuna, Darananawal, Yongu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Nalawawari, Darawari, Dindi, Nanilindinjin. I'd like to acknowledge, as John did, that we're meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and thank you all for giving up a chunk of your Sunday afternoon to participate in this. I know it's a little wet outside, but it's still pretty darn impressive that there's around 50 Canberrans willing to join in a webinar about a complicated public policy issue. Says great things about our community and says great things about you, that you're willing to give up the time to have this important conversation. As John and Amy have flagged, this is an unusual situation that we're coming up to in Parliament. About once every parliamentary term, there's a vote which is effectively a free vote for members of Parliament, where those of us who are in political parties aren't bound to vote a particular way. In the last parliamentary term, the big one you'd be aware of is the same-sex marriage vote, in which members could vote as they pleased. And in the case of mitochondrial donation, we're anticipating that that's going to be a conscience vote as well. And that struck me as a wonderful chance to engage with some of the world's best deliberative democracy experts. The team at University of Canberra and Ohio State University really are world leading, and the way in which deliberative democracy is being used is enormously exciting to me. I worry a lot that Australian democracy is breaking apart, that we're not as engaged as we used to be, and we're not as active as we need to be. With huge public policy problems coming down the line, whether that's dealing with coronavirus and working out who gets the vaccine when it's available, dealing with the economic challenges, tackling climate change, and working out what infrastructure we want in our cities. All of these questions can be better addressed, I believe, through deliberative democracy. So what you're part of today is a process that will inform my thinking about how to vote on mitochondrial donation, but will also help inform the way in which deliberative democracy is used. I don't see any reason why Canberra can't be the world's leader for deliberative democracy, and you're an important part of that. So thanks to the university researchers who've put this on. Thanks to all of you for being part of the conversation. I'm not a scientist. Well, I'm a social scientist rather than a physical scientist. So I will do my best to answer all of the questions that you put up today, but I'm still learning about mitochondrial donation as well. So apologies if I don't know every twist and turn of the technology. We're on a journey together, and frankly, that's what deliberative democracy is about. Back to you, Amy.
Thank you. Our first question actually is a little bit scientific, but I think it's something that you would be able to address. The question is from a constituent who asks, are we changing any DNA or are we inserting the donor mitochondria without modification? If there is no modification, just pairing the mitochondria with the host cell?
That may be a little beyond me. My understanding is that it is placing a third person's DNA into the cell in a way that ensures that the mitochondrial mutation, which would otherwise cause mitochondrial disease, isn't passed on. I understand it in terms of what it's aiming to do, which is to produce a child that is genetically related to its biological parents, to his or her biological parents, but which doesn't carry the risk of mitochondrial disease, which, as you know, is an awful disease, often fatal by the time the child is age 12.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a constituent who asks, what is the leading argument against mitochondrial donation?
Yeah, great question. So there's a couple of arguments which have come up. And one of them is that we shouldn't be engaged in genetic engineering in an area in which there is still some uncertainty about the science. People say, well, Britain allowed mitochondrial donation in 2015, and the take-up has been very low since then. People also say, well, parents who might pass on mitochondrial disease to their children have other alternatives. One of those is to adopt, another is to use donor eggs. In a situation in which the family was to use donor eggs, then the child would be biologically related to the biological father, but not biologically related to the biological mother. So the argument that's made is, well, you don't need a change in the law because instead you have this technology which would allow you to safely have a child without mitochondrial disease that was genetically related to one parent. And those who want the change in the law say that's not enough. We, like every other biological parent, would like to have a child who is biologically related to both parents.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you think that we should set up an agency dedicated to regulating and researching reproductive technology, including mitochondrial donation?
We already have a lot of research going on, and it's auspiced through the NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council. That's the chief funding body, and also a body which has been managing the process of considering the potential law change regarding mitochondrial donation. Some of you might have indeed gone on to nhmrc.gov.au. They've got a whole lot of materials there, including consultation papers, and indeed the results of their own deliberative democracy exercise, which was focused around mitochondrial donation. But there's a range of university researchers who are exploring these technologies, and indeed it's that research that's brought us to this point. Right now, mitochondrial donation is recognised as being illegal, banned, not allowed under the law. So it's necessary to have that law change, if it were to be allowed.
Thank you. Our next question is, are there any alternative cures currently being investigated anywhere in the world that do not involve genetic modification?
There's an awful lot of research going on in mitochondrial donation, as you might imagine. A terrible disease affecting children with such a high mortality rate has led to significant research. My parliamentary colleague Mike Freelander was saying to me that as a paediatrician, he's worked with children with mitochondrial donation and seen firsthand the anguish of their parents as they look for a cure to mitochondrial disease. Sorry, I think I said donation rather than disease. He's worked with children who have mitochondrial disease and seen the anguish for the parents and, of course, for the child of mitochondrial disease. But at the moment, we don't have good cures, and in that sense, it's a bit like multiple sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, indeed cancer and heart disease. A lot of smart people working on it, but no one's managed to come up with a cure just yet.
This next question actually, it just came in next, but it builds on what they're saying now. Can you please give an overview of the distribution of the disease in the population? That is, are particular racial or other groups at higher risk? And will this impact the equity of access to mitochondrial donation technology?
As I understand, there's not a particular skew, but others might have more information than that, and feel free either to the Connecting to Parliament team, or if people who have information on the demographics of mitochondrial disease do chime in. I'm not aware of a particular skew. My understanding is that the way in which the treatment would be allocated would be something analogous to the way in which IVF is presently funded in Australia, although that's all still to be worked out because the technology is illegal right now. These sorts of issues of equity and access haven't been explored. But I'd feel fairly uncomfortable if this was a law change that only benefited people on six-figure incomes. And I think it's important that if this law change is to go through, then the technology is made available in a way that's equitable. So I certainly agree with the sentiment of the questioner there.
Thank you. So our next question is kind of about exactly how the process might work. Where would the egg donors come from? Would they have to be Australian citizens? And what diseases would they be screened for?
I suspect the screening process would essentially borrow from the current technology around IVF. So we have fairly good donation systems in place, which ensure a supply of donor eggs. And I suspect that the screening that was necessary for those donor eggs would be similar. My understanding at present is that there isn't a ban on eggs coming in from overseas, but that in practice that's fairly rare. But again, I'm open to be corrected. I don't have first-hand knowledge of IVF, though I know many in the community certainly do, and I've certainly spoken to plenty of constituents who've gone through that process of IVF. Exhilarating when it works, anguishing when it doesn't.
Our next question is, again, more about kind of the medical process. The question is, the process of harvesting eggs from the donor and mother is a complex process. The transfer of mitochondrial DNA is a further complex process. What are the benefits of complicating an already complex process? I'm concerned that eggs will be lost and there isn't a big pool of donor eggs in the first place.
Yes, it is complicated, and it's certainly not foolproof in the way that none of these reproductive technologies are foolproof. The argument for it is that this is the only way of ensuring that parents or potential carriers of mitochondrial disease would be able to have a child who is biologically related to them without the risk that that child would then develop mitochondrial disease. But yeah, it's complicated. I'm still getting my head around the details of the technology, and I'm sure some of the conversations that we have in Parliament when this comes forward in parliamentary debate will centre around the issue of complexity and the very notion of genetic engineering. I understand makes people feel uncomfortable, and certainly we've seen in past debates over IVF, for example, people not supporting the technology because they felt that it's playing God, as some people say.
The next question actually touches on that a bit. Is mitochondrial donation already legal for research purposes, and is the proposed new legislation to extend this technique specifically for reproduction, or is mitochondrial donation illegal for all reasons?
My understanding is that the actual implant of an egg which has been adapted in a way that it doesn't carry mitochondrial disease is illegal, but that there has been work which has been done on the adaptation stage of the egg. So for practical purposes, the scientists working on this are comfortable that they would be able to make the practice work, but they haven't been able to in Australia because of the state of the law. That's not true in other countries. I mentioned Britain before, which has allowed mitochondrial donation.
Thank you. And participants, I'll just remind you that you can still continue to ask additional questions. We have quite a long queue, but Andrew's answers have been very concise and we're moving through them very quickly. So you're welcome to continue to ask additional questions or to offer comments about any of the responses that have been offered so far. Just go ahead.
And if I'm getting things wrong, maybe people should call me out on this. I'm not here claiming to be the great oracle on mitochondrial donation. I'm trying to come to a view like everyone else and really value people's feedback on that as well.
Yes, yeah, feedback and comments are just as welcome as questions. All right, we do have one more question up now for you though. It's leaving aside for now the inheritable aspect of the technology, how can the current legislation be amended to provide the same safeguards currently afforded to IVF?
Yeah, so we haven't seen the legislation at the moment, or we haven't seen the bill at the moment. I'd actually anticipated that it would have been introduced into Parliament in the last sittings term, but the government hasn't done that. I've heard that it's scheduled to go to Cabinet fairly soon, and then after that Greg Hunt would introduce it into Parliament. So the opposition's had a range of conversations with the government about it. But to date, they've been at the sort of high level around the level of detail that you see on the NH&MRC's mitochondrial donation website. We don't yet have the bill, and when we've got the bill, we'll know more about the particular safeguards that are in place. But you know, if the questioner has specific safeguards they're concerned about, I can do my best to answer questions about those.
Thank you. Our next question is, what legal claims would the donor have on the child? Will the donor's parents' details be available to the resulting child when they're an adult?
So certainly no legal claims. So the names on the birth certificate would just be the names of the two biological parents. You wouldn't suddenly have a birth certificate with three parents' names, even although the baby would contain three people's DNA. As to access, I suspect, again, we're back in the world of IVF. My understanding at the moment is it's possible for donors to maintain anonymity, but that there's certainly been a significant number of instances in which, particularly once the child turns 18, they're curious about finding the donor, and that where both parties consent, then that match is made. Interestingly, a friend of mine who I studied with when I was in the States was one of the very first IVF kids, and she eventually, when she was in her late teens, went and found the donor there. It was more for curiosity than anything else. She didn't form a lasting bond, but just wanted to know whose genetic material was there.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is the expected cost of this procedure and how does it compare with other reproductive procedures? Is the cost expected to come down as more people have access to it?
So Amy, the only bit of that I can answer is that yes, surely the cost must come down as we do more, but I don't know what it is at the moment. I haven't seen that in the materials that have been made available to me. But again, if people have details on that, I'd be keen to know. I'd also be interested to know whether that shifts some people's views. So, for example, if we learned that this procedure was a $100,000 procedure rather than a $10,000 procedure, would that shift you into thinking that the current ban should stay in place? Assuming, and I'm asking that on the assumption that we may not be able to figure out the cost today, but I'm sure that by the time we come to the vote, we'll have some sense of the answer to that very important question.
Yeah. So constituents, if you would like to weigh in on that, if that does affect your decision making about it, you can go ahead and enter that as a comment, even in the question area. Okay, our next comment/question is, I've read some of the background information on this topic, and the main concern I have with the unknown is with the unknown impacts of this technique on the child, as we apparently don't know if the disease can still be passed on from the mother, as some mitochondria still transfer with the nucleus, and we don't know the future health effects on the child of donor mitochondria. Is this lack of knowledge, in your view, something that should prevent this technique being implemented?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it does go to one of the challenges we often face in public policy, that very rarely are we choosing between a perfect option and an imperfect option. Most public policy questions are choices between imperfect options. And in this case, I think those who are advocating for a change in the law are doing so based on the fact that right now the disease has such a high fatality rate that in their view, if a solution is able to ensure that genetically related children can have a much lower probability of having or passing on mitochondrial disease, then that's worth doing. But again, let me push back on the questioner. So, for example, if you knew that the probability that these children would subsequently go on to pass on mitochondrial disease to their children, if that, how big a risk should we be willing to tolerate on that? Would a 10% risk be too high? Do we need to get that risk down to 1%? How do you think about this in terms of how big a risk we ought to be willing to bear before the technology is unbanned?
Thank you. Our next question is, will this process be covered by Medicare? Does the proposed legislation include government subsidization of the process?
Haven't seen the proposed bill, but I'm assuming that there would be some significant public assistance for the reasons that we talked about earlier. The notion that this could be a very expensive procedure and therefore only accessible based on significant out-of-pocket costs, I think would be make a lot of people uncomfortable. I suspect that most parliamentarians would want some guarantee that this was going to be available to the bulk of parents with mitochondrial disease rather than only the most affluent.
Thank you. Our next question is, could there be issues regarding the ban against gene doping in the Olympics? If a child has mitochondria donated from an athlete, could that be seen as having an unfair advantage?
What a great question. I'd urge that person to read a great book by David Epstein about genetics and sport. It's the sport gene or something like that. Essentially identifies how much of success in sport these days is determined by your genetics. High jumpers are getting taller, gymnasts are getting shorter, and genes really matter who ends up in the Olympics. But I don't think there'd be any way in which we would regulate this, just as two people can meet at the Australian Institute of Sport and go on to have a child with high sporting propensities. I think if the recipient was fortunate enough to receive some genetic material from an athlete, then just that would be considered par for the course.
Thank you. Our next question is begins with a comment. There's a fundamental difference between the inheritance of mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA. Is this understood? Some commentary has suggested equivalence.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the answer is no, it's not well understood, and I'm still getting my head around these sorts of distinctions. I'm curious if the questioner has time to go back into the chat, what the practical implications are that they see out of that distinction.
We'll keep an eye out for that. So our next question is kind of related to something you've touched on a bit before, but maybe you can expand a little bit. With 3 parents, 2 mothers and 1 father, what issues would need to be considered regarding parental responsibilities?
The donor wouldn't have any role in raising the child. So they would, this isn't like a situation in which a same-sex couple matches up with a friend and the friend donates some genetic material and all 3 play a role in the raising of the child. This is much more in the realm of IVF, in which an anonymous donor donates, but they're not on the birth certificate. They're not there at the birth. They don't have a role in the raising of the child.
Thank you. Our next question is, has there been extensive religious leader consultation? Do we know what religious and spiritual leaders are advising in regards to this?
Yeah, my understanding is there's something of a mix. There's certainly been some religious organisations that have raised concerns, others that have said that they're comfortable with it. My understanding is the NHMRC consultation panel reached out to religious leaders, and there will be a parliamentary hearing, and I suspect some religious leaders will also make submissions to that. Whether that will be sufficient, I'm not sure. One of the things about having been in politics for 10 years now that I notice very often is that people who have strong views on issues often feel they haven't been adequately consulted. So I hope that there's been significant consultation. I hope there'll be more, but I can't guarantee that everyone will feel they've been fully consulted by the end of the process. And again, that's one of the reasons we're doing this deliberative democracy exercise, because we do believe that consultation and thoughtful engagement is the stuff of politics. Politics isn't a job for other people. Politics is something we all do.
All right. And we're just pulling up together some of the comments that that constituents have made back to your questions about cost and some of the other issues as well. We're kind of pulling those together, and I will have those in a minute. But I have one more question for you, kind of a follow on to one of the earlier questions about the nuclear DNA inheritance. Could this technology give parents false hope due to nuclear DNA inheritance? And would parents be screened or genome sequenced to rule out nuclear DNA inheritance? If the maternal gamete mitochondrial DNA is only affected, is the resulting baby guaranteed to be mitochondrial disease-free? And if not, what percentage chances are we looking at? So it's kind of several questions about how much.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I doubt that the procedure is going to be perfect. I suspect that, again, as with IVF, that there's going to be imperfections, and I suspect that there will be some level of error that creeps into this. My question for those who are helping guide my vote: what level of error is acceptable? Should it be 0.1%, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100, 1 in 10? At what point would the error be so large that you would, in other words, that the procedure didn't work and a child was subsequently born with mitochondrial disease? At what point would that be too high, and you would then say, I don't think Parliament should remove the ban?
Thank you. We will be listening for comments in response to that. Speaking of, you were talking about the cost and how that might affect people's decision making on this. So we've actually compiled a number of people's responses to this, and overwhelmingly it seems to be that people feel that cost should not necessarily influence a decision at all. We have one comment where a person says cost means nothing, it should be supplemented. Another one says, regarding cost, I think if it's more expensive, that shouldn't affect the decision. If it's similar cost to other procedures, I think that increases my support for this change in the law. Another says cost and legality should be separate issues. And then there's one more comment that does say, but considering the community cost of not fixing a mitochondrial disease, that should be a consideration of what the community will subsidize. So that seems to be some of the feeling about the cost issues so far. And if there are further thoughts on that, please go ahead and enter those in the question comment box.
I mean, it's really interesting to get that feedback from people, and I think the last comment I found really interesting as well, which is that potentially you should be thinking about the cost not relative to nothing, but the cost relative to raising a child who contracts mitochondrial disease, which is clearly going to be massive. The other point I suppose that people might consider is that cost being relative to the cost of standard IVF practice. If it's considered that potential mitochondrial disease carriers might now opt for IVF, then the cost of that wouldn't be zero to the taxpayer either.
Right. All right, we have another question coming up for you. In the countries where it is currently legal, have there been any genetic problems or future health warning signs in children born using this process?
Not sure. I think the UK is the only country I'm aware of that's done it. But if people have light to shed on that question, I'd be interested.
So another question is, all new tech, this is a comment as well, all new technology when first used has unknown long-term consequences. Shouldn't the law allow the three parents and the medical professionals to assess the risks and the ethics in their case?
Well, the argument that's made by critics is that the community should have a say in removing a ban on this kind of technology, that it's not simply a private matter, but those who oppose removing the ban say that there's the public ought to have a say on something like permitting gene modification. So I understand where the question is coming from. That's a sort of, it's a perfectly defensible, laissez-faire approach, which says it's a private matter. Others disagree and believe that it should be a public matter.
Thank you. So another question is a little bit more about the risk, which I know you've touched on before, and they're asking if you have any kind of sense of the amount of risk. What are the potential risks involved in mitochondrial donation compared to the risks of conceiving a child naturally? Is it a lot riskier or only slightly so?
Sorry, so I mean, the question there is, what's the risk of the child contracting mitochondrial disease?
I guess the hereditability of it.
So my understanding is the hereditability is significant, but not 100%. But I don't have those numbers in front of me. That should be a number we should be able to get fairly quickly. So if someone's able to pull that up and throw it into the chat, that would be great.
So another question is kind of about the process for developing legislation on this. So this will be a new bill and not an amendment of current IVF legislation, and if so, why is that?
It'll be a new bill. I don't know whether it's amending IVF legislation or whether it will amend some other law. We're still waiting to see the details of the bill.
Okay. All right. Our next question is, if this procedure stays illegal in Australia, would it be illegal for an Australian to get the procedure done overseas?
No, wouldn't. There's only a few laws of Australia's which have extraterritorial reach. If you're bribing a foreign public official, if you're engaging in child abuse overseas, then the Australian law reaches out to grab you where you are. But with those couple of exceptions, Australians overseas are subjected to the laws of those countries. If you go to a country with different laws, whether they're different laws relating to shoplifting or different laws relating to murder, then they're the laws that apply to you.
Thank you. Our next question builds on one of your previous responses. The question is, you previously mentioned acting like God. How much does the religious view impact on this change in law?
How much does it impact, or how much should it impact?
That's the way the question's asked. Maybe it means perhaps how much do you think it should?
Yeah, so and I certainly think that these views should be taken into account. Strongly felt views stemming from theology are no more or less valid than strongly felt views stemming from other ideologies. If you have certain views about child rearing which come from the way in which you were raised, then that's as important to me as if your views about child rearing come from your deeply felt religious beliefs. So we ought to take this into account. And I think back to the same-sex marriage vote. I was aware that some of those who opposed the change did so based on their religious views. It was interesting to me too to see some of those who supported the change doing so from their religious views as well. So there was a plurality of opinions that came forward, shaped by people's religious views. Religion's an important force in Australian public life, an important force in shaping how people think about complicated problems. Many people faced with hard decisions will prey on them and will look to religious leaders and religious texts for guidance. I don't see anything wrong with doing the same in this case.
Thank you. So our next question is kind of about a background condition to this. Would the prospective parents be well enough to have a child, or would they also be sufferers of the disease?
So the prospective parents, I think, would be unlikely to be sufferers of the disease, given that the disease is so brutally fatal to young children. My understanding is that relatively few people who contract mitochondrial disease would be able to bear healthy children. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me in the text. Sorry, in the chat. So we're talking about carriers rather than people who've suffered the disease themselves.
Great, thank you.
But they may have had other children who have suffered mitochondrial disease, so they may have that direct connection.
Right. Our next question is, if there were to be negative outcomes from this technique discovered down the track, would there be some way to identify who's been born as the result of the technique, and if relevant, who the donor was?
Yes, all of that information would be in place, and you know, much as happens with IVF, it would be possible to reach back through if, for example, a single donor had been associated with adverse outcomes in multiple children, then that would certainly be flagged. One of the ways we seek to minimise that with other assisted reproductive technologies is to minimise to place a cap on the number of children that can be born with the donated genetic material of a particular donor. So a sperm donor, for example, can't go on to father 100 children. There's a cap. It's like 5 or 10, something in that order. And I would imagine something similar would apply here, perhaps with an even lower cap.
Thank you. Our next question is there any research going on for a cure other than this DNA procedure?
Plenty, but it hasn't borne fruit yet. And given the resources that have been poured in and given the heart-rending impact of mitochondrial disease, those who work on it aren't anticipating finding a cure anytime soon.
Okay, that's good to know. Our next question is, does the procedure require creation of embryos deliberately for destruction? Some of the objections I've read are opposed to this, but it's not clear to me if this is actually required.
I'm not sure either. I don't know whether there are additional embryos which are created beyond the one that's implanted. If people have answers to that, I'd be interested to know in the chat. If that changes your view as to the appropriate course of action, let me know too.
Yeah. Yes, please. If you have responses to any of the questions that Andrew is putting back out to you all, just kind of note what it's in response to, you know, your perception of risk, or, you know, whether it requires possible destruction of additional embryos, or any of the other questions that he's kind of queried you all about. Just kind of note that in your answer and go ahead and submit that in the same question comment box. Our next question is it essential that this procedure would be publicly funded?
It is not essential to the removal of the ban. So in principle, one could remove the ban and have it fully privately funded. I think many of those on the chat have indicated that they would be uncomfortable with that. Those who came back in response to our earlier discussion and said that they felt that this ought to be an accessible procedure, I think were reflecting what I would anticipate would be the view of many of my parliamentary colleagues right across the political spectrum. My Liberal colleagues tend to be more free market than my Labor colleagues, but I think Liberal and Labor alike, people who support removing the ban on mitochondrial donation, wouldn't want it to only be a procedure that was available to the most affluent Australians.
Thank you. Our next question kind of gets into a little bit of some of the legal questions around this. When nuclear DNA is donated, there's a biological process that shuffles the genes such that no two individuals will be identical. Mitochondrial DNA is transferred identically generation to generation, albeit with a very low mutation rate. So who has rights to approve mitochondrial donation? Great-grandmother, grandmother, donator?
Only the donor under the proposal. So as I understand it, there wouldn't be an attempt to reach back to your ancestors to ensure that they all approved of the donation. And I suppose there the philosophy is similar to IVF, which is that a donor, a sperm donor or an egg donor, doesn't need to ask their parents, even although it's effectively their parents' DNA that they're passing on.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is a very practical one. When is the vote likely to be?
We're assuming that it was going to be November, and that was based on the bill being introduced in the last parliamentary sittings. Now I suspect the final sittings block of the year is the earliest that it could come up, because what we're anticipating is that there will be a parliamentary inquiry that takes place. So Greg Hunt would introduce the bill into Parliament. It would then go off for a committee inquiry. You'll be in the vanguard of that because you're thinking through it now, but it'll be more of a media conversation at that point. More public submissions, more kind of public conversation around it, and then a vote at the end of the year. But it may well be that vote takes place at the beginning of next year instead.
And we actually have gotten some responses on the scientific questions that you were asking about. So one person offers a correction on there are many mild forms of mitochondrial disease. Indeed, many prospective mothers will likely be suffering from a mild form of mitochondrial disease. It's hard to predict severity and inheritance because of the variability in the way that mutant mitochondrial DNA genes are distributed in the mother's eggs. So just a little bit.
I appreciate that correction.
Yeah. And there's another response to another a quote from Hames et al. 2017 on the same point. However, the women who are the targeted beneficiaries of PNT-MST have mitochondrial disease themselves and yet have a quality of life that has enabled them to get to the point of wanting to start a family. This is an indication that the impact of mitochondrial diseases is much more variable than presented in the debates. Any thoughts on that or response to that?
I appreciate the correction. One of the great things about doing forums with Canberrans is you end up with plenty of people who are smarter and more knowledgeable than you. So please keep those corrections coming.
Thank you. So our next question is, could we wait until we know more about the outcomes from mitochondrial donation procedures in the UK before Australia goes through the expensive and time-consuming process of legislation, regulatory, and clinical change? Could Australia support prospective parents to have access to mitochondrial donation in the UK in the short term?
So we could wait, although Britain, as I understand it, changed their laws in 2015. So the question, I suppose, would be how long you'd wait. And those who argue for a change would say that the degree of suffering is substantial, and so you're asking people to wait in a situation in which they might age out of being able to have kids. So if you're talking about parents who are in their late 30s and you're asking them to wait a decade, fertility goes down a lot and the risk of birth complications goes up considerably. I don't think we would countenance the sort of tourist approach, even although my sort of hardline economist friends might say that it's optimal. I suspect that in practice, for an issue like this, the community would not be comfortable with an approach that says, we're going to keep it illegal in Australia, but we're going to fund people to fly to Britain to undergo the procedure. Even assuming that we move past all of the COVID lockdowns and we're back to the world of flying that we're in last year, I think there would be some significant community discomfort about the government flying to Britain flying people to Britain to undergo a procedure that is illegal in Australia.
Excellent. I wanted to remind our participants that we are making very quick progress through the question queue. So if you all have additional comments on anything that Andrew has spoken about already, please go ahead and feel free to enter those in there. Andrew, are there any other kind of questions that you have? I have a couple more for you, but anything else that you kind of wanted to query the audience about right now?
I'm really keen to hear more from people who approach this with strong concerns. What are the main concerns that are in your mind? So I think that a lot of the materials from the NH and MRC talk about the arguments for changing the law. But if you're uncomfortable with changing the law, tell us more.
Great. Yes. Please do so. Take your time and feel free to enter those comments whenever you have them. Our next question is, does current research involve primates or others of the animal kingdom? And if so, would the legislation cover their rights?
Wow. I don't think so, but I don't know for sure. In terms of what the legislation currently covers, in terms of animal rights, our laws are pretty limited, as anyone who's sort of followed the animal rights debate would be aware, whether it's the writings of Peter Singer or others in this space. The laws protecting the bodily integrity of animals are pretty limited in Australia.
Thank you. Our next question is a little bit, again, about kind of some of the scientific and legal implications. Is there currently pre-implantation genetic diagnosis where embryos are created using IVF and then tested before implantation to look for the lowest proportion of mutated mitochondrial DNA used in countries where mitochondrial donations are currently legal?
I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that would be a kind of core priority of doing this, that the aim of before any implantation would be to ensure that the implanted embryo had a very low probability of becoming a child that ultimately developed mitochondrial disease.
Thank you. Our next question is, will longitudinal data gathering and study be mandated in the proposed legislation if not written in yet? And if it's not written in yet, would you consider adding a longitudinal data collection mandate for ongoing scientific prosperity?
Yeah, great question. No, we should certainly be doing that. If only because other countries would then be looking to Australia in the same way as we're looking to Britain, and it's important for us to know the impact. Also, in terms of public funding, I think there will be questions asked down the line. So that seems absolutely critical. And if it's not there, and I see a way of encouraging the government to include it, I'd be happy to do that. And I suspect that is an amendment that would be supported by people even who opposed mitochondrial donation. My guess is, and please refute me on this on the chat if I'm wrong about this, the people who oppose mitochondrial donation would nonetheless say, if it has to go ahead, I want it to be studied properly.
Right. Yes, and if you do have responses to Andrew's questions about what concerns you might have about making a change to our law or to kind of medical policy related to this, go ahead and please do share those, and we'll share those with Andrew as well for his response. In the meantime, we have a question that asks, how are children who have mitochondrial disease supported by the government at the moment? What's being done for them right now?
Through the public hospital system and through the Medicare system, but you can still get significant out-of-pocket costs as well. So it's financially burdensome for families as well as enormously emotionally draining as well. And naturally, as with any other serious health condition for children, it can mean that parents don't work as much as they would have otherwise. So there's a significant cost in foregone income.
Our next question is, mitochondrial DNA profiling is used in criminal convictions. How does this technique complicate future criminal law?
Fascinating. Wow. I have no idea whatsoever. My guess is that we don't catch many criminals who would otherwise have contracted mitochondrial disease. And so the numbers that we're talking about are unlikely to have any significant impact on law enforcement. If you were talking about a technique that was going to be applied to a quarter of all births, then I think you might be potentially concerned about the impact that it had on law enforcement. If it's applying to 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 births, I suspect most people would think that it was never going to have more than a trivial impact on law enforcement. Nonetheless, fascinating question.
Yeah. Our next question is, as a society, we've worked through issues of sperm and egg donation, IVF, etc. What new ethical issue does mitochondrial donation create?
It's that notion of a baby with 3 people's DNA that I think is unusual and unique to this situation.
Another question very much related to that is, are there any other genetic engineering procedures currently available to parents in Australia?
Well, to the extent that you'd regard IVF as some form of genetic engineering, then there's that. But I can't immediately think of other procedures of this kind. If there's suggestions that people have, please chime in. Of course, there's a lot of research going on internationally around genetic editing. Largely that's in non-human animals and plants, but the ability of CRISPR-Cas9 to allow gene editing is being used in a whole range of different contexts, right up to the now discredited scientist who was able to say that they'd produce clone babies.
Thank you. Participants, I'll just remind you that we still have a little bit of time left in our town hall, not quite half an hour. So please do feel free to ask any additional questions or to make any additional comments about anything that Andrew's asked for your views on, or on anything else, on any of his responses as well. We just go ahead and click the question button, but you can click a comment or a question in there. So our next question is, Andrew, what are your personal views on mitochondrial DNA donation, and what would change your mind about it?
I'm interested in the technology, but I maintain an open mind on it. I'm conducting this process because I haven't arrived at a fixed view on the technology, and I'm interested in learning from others. I think you'd be kind of disappointed to be joining this conversation if I told you that I'd figured out what I was doing and that you were mere window dressing. I'm genuinely interested in understanding the topic from the views of Fenner residents. What I also hope that I can do is to bring a range of these views onto the floor of the Parliament, because one of the great things about doing this in collaboration with the University of Canberra and Ohio State University experts is that I will hopefully be able to hit the floor of the Parliament, not only better understanding the scientific and legal issues, but better understanding the political debates. So I'm really hoping to be able to act as a conduit through to Parliament for a set of these concerns, and to raise the level of sophistication of the parliamentary debate as a result of forums like this one. And we've got an in-person version of this happening tomorrow night.
Thank you. And yeah, so Andrew's just been describing the impact that your comments in this forum will make, so please do feel free to enter those. So one question is kind of for you on the same topic. So what will inform you most in terms of making a decision?
The views of constituents through this deliberative democracy process, Amy.
But are you also considering, you mentioned some of the things that you were wondering about, the amount of risk that would be would be acceptable, or the potential of cost or things like that. So I would imagine those things. Any others that haven't come up that are kind of also questions that are kind of forming the parameters of how you would come at this question?
Yeah, so I'm trained as an economist, and economists' main tool of decision making is cost-benefit analysis. Add up all the costs, add up all the benefits, compare the two. If the benefits outweigh the costs, then go ahead. But in something like this, there are just so many costs and benefits across the spectrum. It's kind of hard to add them all up, even to work out a common currency for adding them up. But that would be how I would approach most public policy questions.
Thank you. We do have a few more questions coming in from folks, and we still have plenty of time for those if you have some more.
If my voice lasts.
That's fine. Is there any evidence of mental health implications, positive or negative, on a child that has 3 genetic parents?
We don't have any at the moment that I know about. So, how would you think this through? I would envisage that the child would be slowly introduced to the idea of the donor parent, and that would be done as they got older. My prior, I suppose, would be that this would be less jarring for a child than IVF. So in IVF, the child learns at some point in their growing up that either mum or dad is not biologically related to them. And so there's people talk about the kind of risk of a disconnect with that particular parent, discovering that particular parent has been raising the child but doesn't share the child's genetic material. You wouldn't have that jarring impact here. What you'd have instead was the notion that a child thinking to themselves, some of me is mum, some of me is dad, and some of me is person X. And then thinking about the impact that the person X has on them. So to the extent that we know something about mental health impacts of IVF, my understanding is that that is not those problems are not massive, and I would expect them to be smaller in this case. And the parent would also be saying to the child, the reason that we went through this process is because we didn't want you to suffer from mitochondrial disease. How would that affect a child? So I suppose an IVF child is told the reason we went through this process is so that you could come into the world, so that you could be born in the first place. And hopefully in the mitochondrial donation case, as in the IVF case, the child would feel some degree of comfort from those statements. But it's certainly something that should be explored, and it'd be worth people thinking carefully about what the IVF evidence can teach us in this new and unique case.
Thank you. Another question from a constituent is, would it be worth screening the general public for mitochondrial diseases?
It's very rare. So we're talking about 1 in 5,000 or 1 in 10,000. So typically, we don't screen at that level. Simply because it's prohibitively expensive in order to screen for that, and you could identify a range of other rare conditions.
And we're starting to get in some of the responses. People put quite a bit of thought into some of the questions that you've asked. We're just kind of getting those together. I have a couple other questions that have already come in for you now. The one is, do you anticipate that a vocal group of MPs with strong moral and religious views will have a disproportionate influence on the outcome in any future debate about the proposed legislation?
I would hope that everyone has moral views, but I do know where the question is coming from, the notion that there would be blocks that would form. I suspect that's likely. We saw that in the same-sex marriage debate. Everyone got a vote, but in the end, there were small groups of parliamentarians on both sides who took the lead in arguing the yes case or the no case. And I'd anticipate that happening again in this context. Probably there would be, to the extent that the opposition is associated with particular churches or particular religious groups, you might imagine that parliamentarians that shared that faith took up the mantle of those arguments. On the other side, I suspect it would be parliamentarians with a medical background that took up the case in favour of removing the ban. I mentioned before my colleague Mike Freelander, who's a former paediatrician. People like that, I suspect, would be in the forefront of arguing for the change. Given that he's introducing the bill, you'd anticipate that the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, would also be a voice in favour of removing the ban. It's hard to see how he could introduce the bill otherwise.
Thank you. Our next question is, have there been any arguments against legalizing mitochondrial donation for fear of inappropriate use of the technology, such as a slippery slope argument that says, if we allow this, where do we draw the line at other genetic modification, like gender choosing or designer babies?
Yes, I would expect that would come up. The bill will need to be drafted in such a way that it's quite clear that it is available to people who are at risk of contracting mitochondrial disease. It might also, we haven't seen the bill, so we don't really know, but in principle, the bill could be drafted in a way that it doesn't name mitochondrial disease, but it talks about the characteristics of a medical condition that would allow this. And that would then allow mitochondrial donation in the case of, which in a more generic case that prevented the passing on of hereditable diseases in instances in which donor mitochondria could make a difference. So we'll see how that goes. If those, but those safeguards will be something that I'm sure the drafters of the bill will be thinking hard about in order to head off these so-called slippery slope arguments.
Our next question is kind of somewhat related to that. It's in response, I think, to one of your earlier queries. So the comment is, for me, this is a case of trying to weigh up the importance of having a genetically related child benefit with the scientific unknown, risks. There are still many unknowns about mitochondria biology, replication, inheritance, interaction with nuclear DNA, etc., and mitochondrial donation techniques. I wonder if society should value more diversity, people who can and can't have children or have children in other ways, which means the potential benefit is less significant than the remaining scientific unknowns. Could you comment on the value society places on genetically related children from an ethical, philosophical point of view?
Yeah, it's a hard question because I don't know too much about the science around the bond between parents and children when there isn't biological relation. We can all see instances in which parents adopt a child or foster a child and bestow upon that child just as much love as they would on a child who was biologically related to them. But given the fact that adoption is fairly rare and that most parents prefer to have kids who are biologically related to them, that is, hardly anyone chooses IVF if they're able to have biological children. I suppose we can conclude that there's some general desire in the population to have kids that are related to you, to pass down your genetic material. And the question here, I suppose, that's been raised in some of the conversation in the mitochondrial disease community is whether someone who was faced with a choice of rolling the dice on having a child that might contract mitochondrial disease versus going through IVF with a donor egg might choose the former over the latter.
Thank you. So our next question is a bit scientific, but I will go ahead and ask it of you because it kind of goes to the idea, I think, of the risk that people are wondering about with this. Can there be any mixing of healthy and diseased mitochondrial genes on mitochondrial replication in the reconstructed zygote?
I don't know, but if somebody does, please give us the answer in the chat.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't clear from some of the background reading that I did either. So, okay. Our next question is, given that technology is now available that can predict the probability of a child inheriting certain diseases, allowing parents to make decisions based upon these probabilities, how different, from a merely probabilistic perspective, are the normal risks faced by couples intending on having a child from those faced by parents intending to participate in mitochondrial donation or another form of genetic modification?
Sorry, I'm not sure I'm catching the two risks that we're comparing there, Amy.
Okay.
So what are the two risks?
Yeah, let me repeat it. So how different are the normal risks faced by just a couple intending on having a child from those faced by parents who are intending to participate in mitochondrial donation? I guess just like the risk of anybody having a child versus the risk of a parent who would be worried about having who would need mitochondrial donation.
Sorry, I'm still not entirely sure that I understand the two risks. Is the question, what are the odds of mitochondrial disease for a typical parent? Is that what we're asking?
I think that it's a question of how does that compare to the risks of all the other risks that that any parent might face when deciding whether or not to conceive.
Sure. So mitochondrial disease is 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 10,000. That's obviously much smaller than a range of the other risks that that new parents would face.
Thank you. All right, here's another question. Would or could a legislative amendment allow the procedure to be used for the improvement or enhancement of performance or other attributes? I'd be a lot less comfortable with this than using it to treat illness.
Yeah, me too. So I think that this will this proposed change is going to be around allowing mitochondrial donation, that is allowing the sort of genetic procedure that has been proposed in order to ensure that a potentially fatal disease isn't passed on, not in order to ensure that a child gets into Mensa or the Olympics.
Thank you. So our next question is, how do you take your benefit cost analysis approach and integrate the ethical issues in this equation? How do you take into account the costs and benefits that may have an indeterminate value?
Yeah, so as I was saying before, I was just responding to that broad question as to how I make decisions. But in this case, there's a whole panoply of values that are thrown up and different ways of looking at it. So I don't think there's any easy kind of put everything on one side of the scales or the other and then see which way the scales tilt. I think it's a much more complicated decision than that, as this terrific conversation is illustrating.
I'm pulling in some of the comments on concerns about some of these changes. So one of them, so some concerns we heard about this issue, mitochondrial donation, would be that it could create a new and corruptible market for good or best DNA, kind of related to something that people were talking about, things being used beyond just to treat illness. And then another one says, it would create or promote an attitude of disrespect for the human life that is an embryo, if some or many embryos are trashed in favor of or to market higher quality embryos. So a couple of responses to some of the kind of concerns that people do have about exactly how this should be implemented. We also had one more that came in via email, which says that as mitochondria disease is inherited either via DNA or via maternal mitochondrial inheritance, there's still a very large chance of the resulting baby inheriting the disease. So this procedure is paving the way for designer babies, DNA manipulation, and it's a step towards transhumanism and effectively playing God. From a religious standpoint, this would be considered abhorrent in the eyes of God. Purely from a biological science standpoint, we are going to be manipulating the human genome and further interrupting our biological evolution. The human evolutionary process has effectively been manipulated already with the advent of modern medical science. The longitudinal implications of this need very, very careful consideration, such as the increased load on an already drained and understaffed, under-resourced health system. There are many, many unknowns, and this is not proven to be 100% effective, so more research is never a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I did very much appreciate that view. I did ask before for people, those who were uncomfortable with technology, to throw those views into the chat. So I appreciate that, and certainly chimes with the NH and MRC's consultation paper, which said at one point, quote, "Organisations representing religious stakeholders and individuals presenting religious views were generally not supportive of the introduction of mitochondrial donation." So that's likely to be a key dividing line, I think, in the public debate when it goes national.
On the other hand, our next question actually is from someone who sounds like they are very, very in favor of this. The question is, shouldn't we regard ourselves at the very, very earliest stages of a very long-term process whereby mitochondrial disease is eliminated? Shouldn't we be visionaries?
Trying to eliminate mitochondrial disease, I'm sure, is a view which is shared right across the debate. The difference, I suppose, would be that those who say that the ban on mitochondrial donation should stay would argue that mitochondrial disease should be eliminated through research to directly treat it, and that the way of reducing the probability of mitochondrial disease being passed on is through donor eggs, rather than this sort of three-person DNA.
All right, I've got a couple more questions in the queue here. If anybody has any kind of urgent last questions that they'd like to get into, we still have time for a few more questions or comments before we try to wrap up here. Our next question is, do you think many parents will choose the option of mitochondrial donation if it became available?
Yes, I imagine that many of those in that position would choose it. But again, probably cost is going to be one of the big deciders.
And so we have another comment coming into so we also have another question on kind of related to the idea of being a, kind of going forward with this. It's, if all new technologies are to be banned upon their inception, how is Australia ever to advance on the global technological stage? How can progress ever be made in a culture that shuns the new?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and there's sort of principles that scientists talk about in this context. One is the notion of permissionless innovation, which Grace Hopper popularized. The idea that we get the most innovation if people don't have to ask permission. That if people have ways in which they're able to experiment, then society gets a whole lot more innovation, is able to move forward much faster. The reverse approach to that is the so-called precautionary principle, the idea that when faced with a new technology, we should, in general, be risk averse because of its potential to spread into other areas. So this has been, the precautionary principle has been applied, for example, with genetically modified organisms. The approach that Europe takes on regulation of GMOs does adhere to the precautionary principle. More broadly, something like the Large Hadron Collider, people argue that the small probability that could cause a very large explosion was a reason not to allow it. So these two philosophies do butt up against one another in an instance like this one. We don't think the technology is likely to destroy the world, but those who advocate the precautionary principle will say, well, we need to move slowly with a technology that is still in its infancy.
Thank you. So we've had some comments kind of back and forth. I'm thinking about the idea of potentially creating a competitive market for this kind of DNA. But there's one specific question just asking your views on it. Do you think that creating a competitive market for genetically manipulated material is a cost or a benefit?
So this would be an instance in which people who want to provide the material also offer it at certain prices. Where's the is the price being set by the human donor or by the research team?
It's not exactly clear. I just kind of asked what they enter, but I'm guessing it's the idea of creating a market for particularly specially designed genetic material, kind of the idea of the slippery slope, you know.
Yeah. Look, economists, Amy, like markets most of the time. Here, I worry that there's potential adverse outcomes if people are, if research teams or donors are competing on price. That in a context in which we're not quite sure how things could go wrong, that there's a risk that price competition might lead to ethical corners being cut.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have another question that is, what are your views on the sanctity of human life? Our world's becoming less and less spiritually engaged, and I believe that those elected to represent Australia should have a deep understanding and respect for spirituality and the sanctity of human life.
Yeah, so I certainly take the main debates here. In terms of abortion, I believe it should be safe, legal, and rare, and that's essentially the position that's enshrined in Australian law. The debate comes up with capital punishment. I share the broad view that capital punishment isn't an effective way of deterring crime. And wouldn't be appropriate even if it were. And I think we pay too little heed to the well-being of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. A lot of my research as a professor focused on issues of poverty and disadvantage, and I see that in terms of the resources that we put into pre and antenatal programs. You look at the awful incidence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which leaves children unable to engage in a happy, productive, and healthy life because of that damage that occurs in 9 months in the womb. We also know a lot about the value of nurse home visits. Again, that's for me a question of sanctity of life. If you believe that every child has an equal moral worth, then I think you should want to ensure that kids born into the most disadvantaged circumstances receive the support that they need in order to flourish. And it's an issue for schools as well. I don't think we do enough to ensure that we get great teachers into disadvantaged schools, that kids in vulnerable communities have access to high quality early learning. So all of those are pretty important to me, and shaped my research when I was an Australian National University professor, and shaped my philosophy now as a Member of Parliament.
Thank you. So one more question. Given the science-religion divide, how can our democracy ensure equal representation in the final legislation? Majority should carry the day, but not at the cost of minority views. What do you think that might look like?
So I think we have to make a decision as whether or not to lift the ban. So there will be, in the end, a minority that don't get their way. Either the minority that say that the ban shouldn't be lifted, or if it is, or the ban that say the majority that the ban should be lifted if it stays in place. So someone's going to be disgruntled. The group most affected are a minority and a tiny minority of the Australian public, potential sufferers of mitochondrial disease and their kids. So in that sense, the whole debate is over what will happen with this minority, and the views of that community, I think, are very clear. The push has come quite strongly for a change from mitochondrial disease sufferers, carriers, and their families.
Thank you. All right, and we have time for just one more question, and I promise this is not even a plant from the research team, but I think that this process of consulting the public is a good thing. Will you be doing more of this in the future?
Absolutely. I've got a book coming out in a couple of weeks called Reconnected, which is about the collapse in Australian public life and so civic connectedness and what we can do to turn it around. We talk about volunteering, donating, a whole host of other areas of public life where there's great organisations across Australia that are helping engage, from the kindness pandemic to Orange Sky Laundry. Right here in Canberra, we've seen a whole host of mutual aid groups springing up through COVID. But in the area of politics, I think deliberative democracy has huge potential to make a difference. So doing more of these kinds of exercises will be really important to me, and working with great people like yourself, Amy, and your team at Ohio State University and the team at the University of Canberra, led by John Dryzek. There's a whole lot of research that's being done, and hopefully today's exercise will help to inform that research and will push forward our ability to use deliberative democracy to make difficult decisions, and to recognise that politics is ultimately a participatory sport. One of the things that's damaging politics right now is that idea that it's just all about shouting and jeering, and people treating politics a bit like they treat a game between the Raiders and the Eels, turning up at the stadium, shouting things, not really trying to change the other side. That's great if you're at Canberra Stadium, but it's a terrible problem if you're trying to make a decision as a community. Doing things the way we are today is got to be the way of the future.
Thank you. All right, well, I want to thank everyone for offering questions and comments, and thank Andrew for engaging in this discussion. I know you've been talking for quite a long time, but are there any closing remarks you'd like to offer?
Thanks for being part of the conversation. You guys are amazing. The day is looking even finer out there. So the sacrifice you've made to be part of the conversation is really appreciated by me and by the research team. If you've got other thoughts on this or anything else, do get in touch anytime. I'm not hard to find on the internet. andrewleigh.com is my website, andrew.leigh.mp@aph.gov.au. If you want to follow up on any thoughts on this, or on mitochondrial donation in particular, on deliberative democracy in general, or any other issues we can help you on.
Thank you. All right, I have just a few closing remarks of ours about the initiative and the research, so hang on just a second, everybody. Again, first of all, thanks so much for participating in today's discussion. Before we end, I did want to let you know that, again, as Andrew mentioned, and we have too, this is a research initiative, and so all of you will receive an online survey to provide feedback about this session and provide updated information about your opinions on this topic. You should receive it at the same email address where you received the link to join the town hall. Your responses will be compiled and shared with Andrew's office, so please do take a few minutes to complete it, as it will help him to make decisions going forward, and will also help us learn how effective this kind of civic engagement is. Andrew already gave you his contact information, but I'll just repeat that again. You can go to www.andrewleigh.com. If you have any additional questions about this town hall or our study, you can contact the University of Canberra Center for Deliberative Democracy at governanceinstitute.edu/au. Thanks so much again for joining today's town hall, and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.